I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. On May 20th, Taiwan held the inauguration of President William Lai, a politician who has pledged to uphold predecessor Tsai Ing-wen's efforts to bolster Taiwan's security and defense through partnership with the U.S. RANE's Asia-Pacific analyst, Chase Blazek, is here to explain what Taiwan's new leadership means for the future of the country's relationship with China and the United States. Hi, Chase. How are you?
Hey, Emma. Doing well. Good to talk to you again.
Good to talk to you as well. So in response to his inauguration speech, China's Taiwan Affairs Office labeled Lai as a dangerous separatist. China's disapproval of the new president doesn't come as a surprise, but was there anything Lai said in his speech that was a deviation from Tsai's Taiwan stance or from the way he previously expressed his platform intentions?
Yeah, a really well-formed question on this because it's really nuanced. A lot of the media coverage from Beijing and Washington, frankly, has sort of run with this whole idea that William Lai is a separatist, a pro-independence guy. And as with everything in geopolitics, but particularly in Taiwan, it's a lot more nuanced than that. He used to run in a little bit more pro-independence circles. He was pro-independence when he was mayor of Tainan back in 2014, and it was a really crowded field of Democratic Progressive Party or Green, as they call them in Taiwan, candidates. And so he distinguished himself by being one of the most pro-independence folks out there in the field. He also gave a speech in 2017 where he alluded to independence, which has been used by analysts in Washington and Beijing to say, see, you kind of got to watch out for this guy. He might be a loose cannon. But if you read even his full remarks from 2017, you see that he also noted, but I basically see Taiwan as already independent, and thus there's no need for us to change anything in the Constitution or what have you. So that's his past, the so-called problematic past that has led many to say, oh, he's pro-independence. You kind of got to watch for this guy. And he is, to be fair, more pro-independence than Tsai Ing-wen. But he's been in her administration for a while now. 2014 was a long time ago, back when he was in Tainan saying all these fiery things. And he has since moderated significantly. So in all his policy statements, both on the campaign trail and even in the inauguration, I don't really see him changing a ton. There were some nuances. He mentioned the Republic of China versus China many times, which is sort of a naming, splitting hairs exercise, but it matters a lot in China-Taiwan relations. And he did so more than Tsai Ing-wen might be willing to do in some of her speeches. So in that way, some of the rhetorical flourishes were more, you could say, pro-Taiwan. But all of his policy stances on the campaign trail and at his inauguration were basically packaged straight out of the Tsai Ing-wen administration. So he's not saying a whole lot new here that would really make Washington need to be worried that he's going to shake things up with China, be extra provocative, either militarily or diplomatically, such that China would feel the need to react in an escalatory manner, at least more so than normal. But it is something to watch, right? Someone on the campaign trail is very different from someone when they get into office. And we've seen this many times in politics. So there's always a possibility that, maybe he does revive that old sort of more pro-independence, rah-rah Taiwan personality. But if we just use the last decade as precedent, he really hasn't. He's avoided all the instances where he could have, had the opportunity to revive that persona. And so it's something to watch for, certainly. But from my view, looking at the inauguration, besides those rhetorical flourishes that we talked about with the naming conventions of Taiwan versus Republic of China versus People's Republic of China, there's not a whole lot in there that's super provocative that would lead us to believe there is this separatist intention in the near term.
That makes sense. And can you elaborate a little bit on how you alluded to this a bit, but how Taiwan's previous administrations compare to Lai?
Yeah, I mean there are a few. Taiwan's first democratic elections, I believe, were in 1996, so it's a pretty young democracy. You can sort of count the number of administrations they've had on one hand, maybe pushing on two here. But the ones that are really important to compare against are the previous president, Tsai Ing-wen, who's from the same party as William Lai, the DPP, and the administration before that. So this was going back to 2016 of the KMT president at the time, who's Ma Ying-jeou, and Ma Ying-jeou took a more conciliatory stance toward China. He didn't concede, we're fine with reunification. Yes, let's all be Chinese. But he did try to tone things down and try to sign economic agreements with Beijing and say, see, if we sort of play nice, there's no reason anybody needs to get taken over and we can have better economic relations. Things will go great. And that tact of Ma Ying-jeou's worked from 2008 to 2012. You could say tensions were dropping, economic ties were rising between China and Taiwan. But then in his second term, 2012 to 2016, this tact of his took a bit of a downward turn. He tried the same playbook, but China started getting a little demanding. They said, great, awesome, we're doing economic engagement. This is fantastic. Now let's get back to the sensitive point of political reunification. Let's talk about this. And the KMT, knowing it needs to get reelected back home in Taiwan, and that the vast majority of Taiwanese people have no interest in reunification. In fact, if you look at the numbers over the decades, pretty consistently around 60% want status quo, which means they don't want to be fully independent. By constitution, I mean, they don't want unification. They just want their day to remain the same. No change. About 20 to 30%, depending upon the time period, want actual independence, constitutional change. And then like single digits, we're talking 2-3% want unification with China. Knowing this, Ma Ying-jeou, when Beijing was saying, great, let's talk politics, he really had to defer or demur and say, no, I'm sorry, we can't do these things. Let's keep talking about economics. And Beijing started getting a little impatient on this, and the economic bon ami, the economic friendship started to degrade a little bit. So around the time that Tsai Ing-wen came to office in 2016, Beijing was already pretty frustrated and started adding to that frustration by putting more sort of coercive techniques toward Taiwan, including cutting off most economic and diplomatic dialogues, cutting off tourism, eventually cutting off tourism from China to Taiwan, and adding small things occasionally like agricultural tariffs that seem to come out of nowhere, citing pesticides or concerns about that in Taiwan. In general, China started upping this economic coercion toward Taiwan, and Taiwan couldn't really do much on this end because they could add similar restrictions on China, but they just don't tend to do that, mainly because Taiwan depends too much on China's economy and China's imports of Taiwanese goods. So they were just in this sort of uncomfortable status quo of China putting economic restrictions on Taiwan and Taiwan just saying, why does Beijing have to be like this? Until in 2020, the second term of Tsai Ing-wen's presidency, and Beijing seemed to hit a point around then when they got frustrated with even just economic tools and they started using more military tools. So that's when you started seeing, really around 2021 especially, more of these incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, that gets thrown around a lot. It's sort of a nuanced topic, but it's not technically, like by international law, airspace that's recognized by the rest of the world. It's sort of like Taiwan put this out and said, this is our definition of our sort of extended airspace. And when you enter this airspace, we want you to call us, let us know you're coming, why are you here, etc. It's a pretty expansive box, but nonetheless, for years, China and Taiwan had sort of tried to agree to minimize incursions into this ADIZ, even though technically it overlaps with China's coastline. And in those ways, China was not able to sort of meet Taiwan's demands here. But with 2020 coming around, China did start sending more aircraft and more naval vessels, I should say military aircraft, into Taiwan's ADIZ, just letting them know, we're here, we don't recognize your ADIZ, we think this is all our territory. But they never got within Taiwan's territorial waters, which is like 12 nautical miles out. And that is internationally recognized as, that would be an incursion into a country's airspace. So that's one way. There was also the military drills around August 2022, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, and China did these live fire drills around Taiwan, I believe in 6 different spaces outside of main ports, still mostly beyond the 12 nautical mile range. But when they did this, they caused a lot of shipping to reroute. They caused some aircraft routes to be reconfigured. And around this time is when you really started getting a lot of international concern that China's starting to consider invasion. This is happening. They're practicing for it. That's why they're doing these air incursions. And so that's partly why you've seen a lot of this rhetoric about Taiwan in the news as of the last few years. And in Taiwan, too, that rhetoric has been ramping up with people considering, fears of Chinese aggression. In Taiwan, that was partly due to Hong Kong as well. In 2020, the national security law was imposed in Hong Kong. And the reason that matters is because Beijing has said, the way we govern Hong Kong, that's the way we'd like to govern Taiwan in the future. So you're technically autonomous. You have quite a lot of freedom, but, we get to decide matters of foreign affairs and national security. And that's not good, because the way national security was decided in Hong Kong is we're Beijing, we do what we want, and you have to take it because you are technically Chinese. And so that scared Taiwanese people too. So this has been the dynamic that in the world at large, people are increasingly concerned about Chinese military action. In Taiwan, they're increasingly concerned about military action. And that's why we have, bringing up to the current day at the inauguration, that's why we have the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, as well as both main opposition parties in Taiwan, the Kuomintang or KMT and the Taiwan People's Party. All of them on the campaign trail had more pro-sovereignty rhetoric than they have in the past. So really, there's no political room in Taiwan for anyone who says, I generally support eventual reunification with China. It doesn't exist anymore. So that makes it very hard to have these discussions between China and Taiwan that Beijing wants to have of like, hey, let's talk about eventually becoming one family again. No one in Taiwan wants to have that conversation, the people or the political parties. And that's why we have the steadily increasing drumbeat of Chinese military coercive activities against Taiwan, with the thinking being, Beijing's thinking that is, if we can't convince Taiwan via political talks or via economic tools to come back to the fold and talk about reunification, we'll use military tools to eventually try to scare them straight. And that's where we are today. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, if I have a quick kind of follow-up question. When the KMT was elected into office, you mentioned that there hasn't been a whole lot of change in terms of the amount of the population of Taiwan that wants reunification with China. So back when there was a more moderate party elected and the concerns were more about local politics, is this an indication, like these new couple elections that have happened with the more, progressive parties into office, is that an indication of anything happening locally, or is it just purely Beijing getting more aggressive and infringing on potentially the Taiwanese people's normal way of life?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. First, on sort of the framing of the question, I wouldn't necessarily call the KMT more moderate. Perhaps on China they are, because they traditionally want to sort of go with the flow. Hey, let's trade with them. Why are we so concerned about them? As long as they're not actively invading us, what's there to be scared about? That's sort of their stance. But they are the conservatives, and especially Ma Ying-jeou, he's sort of like a banner carrier of the conservatives. So I wouldn't necessarily call him a moderate, but I do see what you're talking about there. As far as the rise in local issues, the population that wants unification has been basically literally dying off. These were some people who, back in the day, when Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party lost the Civil War, the Chinese Civil War at that time, 1949, they retreated to Taiwan and set up the Republic of China, or what would be the Republic of China, basically with the idea that, this is temporary. We're going to go back, we're going to win China back, and we'll be the rightful rulers of China. So around that time, that's when you have a lot of these people who have this idea, I've always been Chinese, I will eventually be Chinese again. And so this idea of a Taiwanese identity really started building up in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. And these people who remember the day when they used to live in Fujian province or these other Chinese provinces and they considered themselves Chinese, they're dying. I mean, they're just getting old. And so most Taiwanese people who've never known anything different, especially those under 30 or 40, from really democracy and being Taiwanese, they have no connection to China besides trade, right? A lot of Taiwanese do trade with China, and they've got this shared culture, of course, and shared history. A lot of the best Chinese museums or museums of Chinese art are in Taiwan too, so they've got the historical and cultural ties. But identity-wise, no one really in Taiwan anymore considers themselves Chinese. And so that's the local dynamic, is not only do all the political parties in Taiwan have to play to the pro-sovereignty ideas now, but also they know the people have no interest, they don't see themselves as Chinese, rather, and they have no interest in unification with China. As far as other local issues, I'd say they're just as much of an issue as they always have been, the economy especially. And that was one of the things that was seen as a threat to taking down the DPP this last election in early 2024, is that, as with any country, with any democracy, whatever party's in power for long enough, if they experience economic hardship during that time, whether or not it's the fault of the party in power, that party gets blamed for it. And so the idea was, if we're unhappy with our wages, we being Taiwanese people, we're unhappy with the pension system, we're unhappy with the super expensive housing, especially in Taipei, it's insane, then it must be the government's fault. And who's the government? The Democratic Progressive Party. So those issues really did play into the January 2024 election, and that's why this was a pretty close election. I would say maybe not the only reason, but a big reason the DPP won is it was a split election. The opposition was split between the traditional conservatives, the KMT, which we've been talking about this whole time, and this new party, new as of 5 or 6 years ago, the Taiwan People's Party, which was basically formed out of people who were sick of the division. They were sick of the conservatives and the liberals. They didn't really like how anyone was governing. So they said, we want a different party. And so the election was split 3 ways, and lo and behold, the DPP won. But going into office, and even in his inauguration speech, Lai spoke to a lot of these things, the economic issues that he knows he has to deal with, or else there won't be a 4th term for the DPP, like reforming the labor pension system, like making housing cheaper, which is very difficult to do, like rising wages. It's another issue, just like the US and Europe. So these are the local dynamics playing in. But I will say, at the national elections, the presidential and legislative elections, the issue of China and the US and these sorts of big picture issues do play a much larger part than they tend to play on, for example, mayoral elections in Taiwan. So there is the local, and if you do badly enough on the local, like the economy, you won't get elected. But there's also this issue of China, and the more sort of aggressive China acts, the more appealing parties that seem to champion national sovereignty, like the DPP, will appear and will have a greater advantage, I would say, in winning elections.
If we pivot a little bit to looking forward, how likely are the various scenarios of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and what are the current factors at play that are still up in the air and could impact the likelihood of each scenario that you think could happen?
Yeah, so the general scenario right now is just steadily increasing military coercion from China. Not just, I would say, China uses military coercion, economic coercion. They have negotiations with the KMT to try and undermine the new DPP government. They do lots of stuff in cyber operations, information ops, everything. But primarily increasing military coercion against Taiwan to try and show them that there's no good outcome if you continue to not want to reunify. There's no good outcome for you. It will lead to your military defeat. That's sort of the idea of a lot of this military pressure on Taiwan. The question you're asking is one, maybe an invasion scenario. When does China invade, if they will invade, or something short of that, right? Our take is that an invasion is not imminent. It's not even likely, we would say, in the next 5 years. We currently, on our key forecast question on the website, put an invasion of Taiwan, I believe, at 15% likelihood through the end of 2027. So for the next, around 3 years. And that's for a number of reasons. One, because China, by its own definition, and I would say Xi Jinping's definition, is not militarily ready. He says, by his own admission, we need to militarily modernize through 2027, become a regional leading military power by 2035, become a world leading military power by 2049. So these are sorts of the long-term goals here. And so then it begs the question, are they even ready for a Taiwan invasion yet? And I would say a lot of the pieces are there. Their rocket force, which their missile, their artillery wing of the military has enough of an arsenal, I would say. Their navy's advanced enough, you could say. Their air force, all of these pieces are together, but China really hasn't fought wars. In general, they haven't fought wars in modernity. They did in the late 70s against Vietnam, but it was a Chinese war of aggression against the Vietnamese, and they kind of got their butts handed to them. So in modernity, there's no real example. Like the U.S. has been, messing around in the Middle East for a while, and I'm being facetious, but you know what I mean. The U.S. has been involved in wars in various places in the world, and so has war experience, and China doesn't. And they don't really have the experience of making your Air Force work with your Navy, work with your cyber force, work with your missile forces to do a coordinated attack to fulfill a major military goal like taking an island. And so there's the coordination issue. There's training, right? China doesn't have a lot of at-sea experience with training. When a vessel is sinking, you need to rescue all the sailors, get them back, repair that vessel, send another round of sailors and troops to Taiwan to occupy Taiwan. All of these very intricate things they don't have a lot of practice in, and they're trying to practice more, but by most measures, they're not ready. And then there's the economy too, right? China's economy is doing okay right now, but Beijing is looking at the Ukraine war, at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, seeing how much pressure the United States and Europe are putting on Russia's economy, and realizing that for a much more important strategic goal like Taiwan, and I say important from the U.S. perspective, given Taiwan is sort of the linchpin of the U.S. alliance system or U.S. partnership system in the Pacific, if the U.S. and Europe reacted so strongly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how much more strongly would they react to China's invasion of Ukraine, of Taiwan rather? That'd be an interesting historical alternative fiction there. But China's invasion of Taiwan, and so there'd be sanctions, there'd be cutting off trade of high electronics that China needs for its economy. There'd be obviously the war, and you don't want to lose the war. You want to make sure you can win it, especially against the United States, not just taking Taiwan. So there's all these factors that make it unlikely in the near term. There is one factor pushing for it, and that's Xi Jinping's I don't want to call it a God complex, but a God complex. He sees himself as the herald, the savior of modern China. I'm going to bring us back to where we belong, preeminent on the world stage, the number one power. That doesn't necessarily mean China taking over the world, but if they need to take Taiwan to shove the U.S. out of the Western Pacific, so be it. And he sees himself as bringing about China's national rejuvenation from its defeat, you could say, in the 18th and 19th century at the hands of Western powers when China was weak and frankly got colonized in various ways. So he sees himself as bringing China back, make China great again, and he personally will do that. And he has said on multiple occasions, taking Taiwan, or reunifying with Taiwan, he usually says, is critical for China's national rejuvenation. So he sees himself as the helmsman of national rejuvenation. Taiwan is a key part of that. So that doesn't mean he will, for certain, invade Taiwan by the time he leaves office, but I do believe strongly that means he is not satisfied with the status quo of previous Chinese leaders, which is they are content to kick the can down the road and say, yeah, we eventually want to take Taiwan, but there's no need to do it now. I think he wants to see meaningful progress, whether that means actually starting reunification talks or taking some outlying islands like Kinmen or Matsu Island. I believe strongly he wants to see meaningful progress by the time he steps down. And oh yeah, he's old. he's 70, and you've seen pictures of him. He's not athletic looking. He's a bit overweight, and when you get that old, strokes, heart attacks, all these things you got to worry about. And those things are closely guarded state secrets in China, by the way. They don't talk about these things really until someone dies, and they're like, oh yeah, he was sick. And so we don't know how much longer he'll live, but we know he's in a third term now. Third 5-year term. He'll likely try to pursue a fourth term in late 2027, early 2028, which would take us up to 2032, 2033. Beyond that, he'll be pushing 80, and the question is, how much longer can he honestly do it? So looking into the early 2030s, there's a possibility he really wants to see progress on Taiwan by the time he leaves, given his view of himself and the necessity of China's national rejuvenation. That doesn't just mean invasion, right? We've talked about this before, you and I, Emma, but there's also, in between steps between what we have now, which is steadily growing military coercion, and invasion. There's other things China can do, namely a trade quarantine of Taiwan, where China uses its Navy, its rocket force, its Air Force to do some sort of extended live fire drills like they did in August 2022 when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, to cut off certain trade flows, maybe valuable industrial inputs to Taiwan's chip sector, like wafers or like energy or various chemicals, to try and put pressure on not only Taiwan, but the rest of the world. Say, like, listen, we know you all rely on Taiwan. We want things to go our way as well. We need to figure something out here because the current trajectory of Taiwan is not working for us being Beijing. And so sort of cutting off trade in certain areas for Taiwan for, 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe 2 months, as they conduct these, drills around Taiwan. And the reason they would do it this way is because actually doing a full blockade, that's an act of war. And if China did this against Taiwan, the rest of the world could respond accordingly to an act of war. And so China doesn't want that. They want to sort of, tiptoe in the gray zone here of this trade pressure through a quarantine on Taiwan, with the hope being demonstrating to Taiwan, you're not going to win this. At some point, we're going to bring the hammer down, and you need to come to your senses and be willing to talk reunification with us, or the end may be nigh. That's the fear they wish to strike in Taiwan. And the same thing with the West. They wish to show that, do you care this much about Taiwan? Are you willing to lose your trade of valuable high electronics, all for this little Taiwan, which, by the way, a vast majority of the world's countries don't recognize as a country? Are you really willing to do that? And so that's the sort of the motivation that could strike China to escalate in the future. We don't really see many of those triggers for why China would do that now, to really put that trade pressure on Taiwan and the rest of the world. But if, for example, Taiwan started getting real recognition in international fora, they were admitted to or were represented at the World Health Assembly. They were admitted to the United Nations. They get into various major trade compacts or trade pacts like the CPTPP. I don't want to say the full name, but that's the trade pact. If Taiwan starts getting admitted to many of these, and China sees that de facto the world is recognizing Taiwan because they're admitting them to international groupings, or the US and or Japan start making much more formal defense agreements with Taiwan, not just, we'll help you defend yourself against a potential invasion by China sometime in the future, which is what the current Taiwan Relations Act has for the U.S. defending Taiwan. It's not a treaty partnership, but it does say we'll help you to try and make an invasion not happen sometime in the future, with a little bit of hand waving. If they made that a formal defense treaty, like, no, you're just like the Philippines, you're just like Japan, we will defend you if China comes to you, comes to harm you. This is another trigger for escalatory action by China, seeing that the tides are turning and they can't wait any longer to defend Taiwan. So there's a number of these potential triggers, and if enough of them happen in a row, and including China's economy going in the tank, such that China perceives they don't have as much time as they would like for national rejuvenation, they need to push the timeline forward. If enough of these things happen in combination, there's a potential that China does something like a trade quarantine scenario. Alternatively, they could decide to do a mini invasion, basically, to take the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, which are Taiwanese holdings that are just a couple miles off the Chinese coast. You can see them if you're in China, as opposed to the Taiwanese main island, which is 80 to 100 miles from China, depending upon what point you're looking at. So these small Kinmen and Matsu Islands are much closer to China than they are to Taiwan. Militarily, they would be extremely easy for China to take. Especially from a supply chain point of view. If you look at the war between Russia and Ukraine right now, supply chains are, they're pivotal. What war are you trying to fight, and from how far away? And this would be China fighting a war that's just a couple miles from its coast versus the US and Japan, who are 400 to 500 miles away in Okinawa or in the northern Philippines. And so if they want to defend against this, they have to have 500-mile maritime supply chains, which are easily disruptible by China's submarine fleet. And so it would be pretty easy in the grand scheme of wars and invasions and all that for China to take Kinmen and Matsu Island. again, for the purpose of demonstrating to Taiwan that, hey, your current path is not a fruitful one. And this could be you, this could be the main island of Taiwan, if you don't shape up, basically, if you don't change your policy. And the idea would be if China takes Kinmen and Matsu Islands, these island groupings, it would demonstrate to U.S. military partners in the region, formal military partners like the alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, that the U.S. is not a reliable partner. Look at Taiwan. Technically, they have on the books that they'll help defend against an invasion, but we just did it and it was no problem. We did it against Kinmen and Matsu, and therefore you are also not safe, you being the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, with the goal being that perhaps this realization in Beijing's dreams and Beijing's vision that the U.S. won't protect South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, those countries will stop with their current trajectory, which is greater economic and military relations with the U.S., and instead go back to trying to balance relations between the U.S. and China, and maybe even lean more toward China. And in so doing, they would make the Western Pacific once again a Chinese sphere of economic and military influence, and the U.S. secondary in that hierarchy. Of course, there's problems to this logic, right? If you do this, the cat's out of the bag. The whole world thinks, oh, great, you did Matsu and Kinmen. Now, the main island of Taiwan is next. And so the world would likely react similarly to an actual invasion of Taiwan. They would say, great, we know what's coming. Economic sanctions, general isolation, like what's going on against Russia. And so what is a constraint upon this potential Chinese action against Kinmen or Matsu or these other sort of far-flung Taiwanese islands is that China gets a lot of the cost, the economic cost from international opprobrium and retaliation, without a lot of the benefit. There's not a lot of strategic benefit to China of getting Kinmen and Matsu, besides sending this message to the world, to Taiwan and to the U.S. partners in the region. And so that's another major constraint there on that action. But, potentially in the future, China gets desperate, or Xi Jinping's, has a stroke, is on his deathbed and thinks, I could make some progress. Maybe I'll make some progress on Kinmen or Matsu. Obviously, there's some more serious, less anecdotal triggers that could lead to this. But either way, these two short of war scenarios, a trade quarantine of Taiwan or China taking Kinmen and Matsu, are less likely than what we have now, which is steadily building coercion, military coercion from China against Taiwan. But they are worth watching over time because, as we've seen in the last 5 years, geopolitics can change rapidly. We have a war in Ukraine, a war with Israel. U.S.-China relations have gotten even worse. So things can change, and it's worth watching because of that.
Obviously, the U.S. is a big factor in this equation, and so from a U.S. perspective, what factors such as the 2024 presidential elections could impact these scenarios that you've laid out?
Well, I'd say generally the U.S. has strategic interests in keeping Taiwan the way it is, no matter who comes into office. The U.S. National Security Administration on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, they all agree keeping Taiwan independent, if not constitutionally, at least de facto independent, is good for the U.S. Supply chains in the region, for the U.S. alliance network. And so the U.S. defense establishment is totally in agreement. We need to protect Taiwan. That's not a problem between the Democrats and the Republicans. The individual nuances of how Biden might approach U.S. foreign policy versus how Trump might approach U.S. foreign policy, those could sway one way or another. Some of the nuances of U.S. foreign policy toward Taiwan and China, but not in a major way such that the scenarios I've already laid out would be totally different scenarios. They're about the same buffet we're working with here, no matter who comes into office. The main differences, I'd say, is Biden definitely wants to do this approach of a network of alliances and partners in the Pacific that, we bolster the Japan partnership, the South Korea, the Philippines, the Australia partnership. Oh, yeah, and we bolster the partnerships between those partners, the U.S. South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. Japan, Philippines, and all these different make them as you wish combinations. And in so doing, the U.S. makes sure it has a very tight net of partners in the Western Pacific so they can all jointly say, like, hey, China, back off of Taiwan. But also so that the U.S. doesn't have to take everything on by itself. It could be the South Korean military, or more importantly, the Japanese or the Filipino militaries who are contributing to the security of Taiwan, to the security of the South China Sea. Same thing with Australia, finding this network of partners so that, together we all make the load lighter. We protect our values, international trade, Western liberal democracy, blah, 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 all of this by our joint work together. Trump has taken a much more transactionalist approach to U.S. foreign policy, meaning he wants the U.S. to get the most out of every relationship, every bilateral relationship, which is why we saw, even with close U.S. partners like South Korea and Japan, under Trump's first term, 2016 to 2020, the U.S. had disputes with South Korea and Japan, diplomatic disputes mainly, about cost sharing for U.S. bases and U.S. assets in South Korea and Japan, even though these are some of the closest U.S. partners, right? You would think maybe we don't want to pick fights with our buddies when we're concerned about China or North Korea or what have you. But this is the approach Trump has taken many times when he was in office, is this transactionalist approach, get the best result for the U.S. from every relationship. And in so doing, he may... I don't want to say he'd ruin these partnerships, because they're strong, they're long-lasting, and I generally think they're much stronger than any damage Trump could or could not do when he's in office to this particular relationship with Japan, with the Philippines, etc. But this may make it a much more bilateral approach to, for example, boosting the Philippines' relationship to defend Taiwan or what have you. And in so doing, Trump could push some of these countries to want to take a more balanced approach to relations with the U.S. And China. I don't think that means these countries will stop their own military modernizations like Japan or the Philippines or South Korea, but that just means they may be less on board with U.S. interests in the Western Pacific, knowing that the U.S. under Trump is perhaps a little bit more volatile, perhaps a little bit more unpredictable than they would like, and thus they need to get some things done by themselves. As far as which scenarios could change depending upon a Biden or Trump presidency, I think in general, we still have this growing military coercion scenario of China against Taiwan, and that's the baseline, most likely scenario. But as far as the alternative scenarios, short of invasion, we still have the trade quarantine scenario. I think that's more likely under a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency. Still not likely in general, but if we're doing comparative here, and that's because the Biden administration really values these strengthening and interlocking supply chains with Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, etc. And so China taking this approach of threatening those supply chains by cutting off supplies of Taiwanese chips or other high-tech goods from Taiwan would have more oomph, more power, more potential impact on U.S. policy, and thus might be a better negotiating tactic or a better coercive tactic against the U.S. And under a Trump presidency, I still don't think Kinmen-Matsu or China taking Kinmen and Matsu is necessarily a likely or even a 30% scenario. I think it's even less than that in the next 5 years. But if it were to happen, I would think it would be more likely under a Trump presidency, just because Trump does tend to be a little bit more, like I said, unpredictable, and at times to do things based off of very short decision horizons. Like I don't care what China says, we're going to do X, Y, Z here, like sailing a U.S. aircraft carrier around Kinmen or Matsu, even though it's technically in China's territorial waters, in order to show we will defend them, and sort of pushing China to do the very thing the U.S. doesn't want them to do. So it's sort of a convoluted action-reaction scenario I'm talking about here, but because of Trump's a little bit less predictability, it's possible that a less predictable or more volatile situation like the Kinmen and Matsu Islands happens. But again, to clarify, I don't think the palette, the buffet of options we have here between China's actions toward Taiwan changes a lot depending upon a Biden or a Trump presidency.
So Chase, just to wrap things up here, what can companies and organizations internationally and with more direct interests in both China and Taiwan, what can they expect based on the scenarios you've provided so far?
Yeah, I'd say don't expect war anytime soon necessarily, but know that fears and preparations for that contingency war are growing over time, and it's not completely out of the realm of possibility for sure. I don't want to give that impression, And that even these short of war scenarios, a trade quarantine or China taking Kinmen or Matsu, are still fairly disruptive to global economic relations because of the retaliation that would come from the U.S. and Europe on China, et cetera. So I would say what is currently going on is probably most businesses' best course of action, and it's sort of a consolation prize because most businesses would probably prefer they don't have to choose markets or they don't have to lobby against these problems, but continuing what they're doing now, which is lobbying for their interests, of course, but also preparing with the supply chain and business operations diversification plans. And this is what, if you see major businesses leaving China or even, leaving Taiwan eventually, I won't name any names, but this is what they're looking toward, is not putting all their eggs in one basket. Of course, they still want to access the Chinese market. They still want to access good, high quality production in China and cheaper comparatively labor in China compared to the West. And so they're keeping operations there, but they're slowing the pace at which they're expanding investments. They're adding new projects in China, and rather many more are opting to sustain, and a slowly growing minority of businesses are opting to scale down their operations in China. And I suspect if some of these more escalatory scenarios do start to come to fruition in the future, like a trade quarantine or Kinmen-Matsu or even a war, the same will be true for Taiwan too. Folks will start to get out of Dodge, so to speak, not completely, but to reduce their risk profile. And you're seeing countries like Japan and Singapore benefit from this because they're seen as less risky destinations, comparatively speaking. Of course, any sort of worst case war scenario over Taiwan would also impact Japan directly because all the U.S. bases there. So Japan would, if not be an active combatant in the war, be at least heavily involved in supply chains and be vulnerable to targeting from China due to the war. And same thing with the Philippines and potentially South Korea and the Strait of Malacca around Singapore. Could get blockaded as well, or get blocked rather by the U.S. or China to stop trade from one another, their supply chains. So the whole region is really in danger from what's going on here, and so all of this is sort of picking the lesser of two evils. Like, you're not going to a completely safe place, but you're going to hopefully a safer place than China, maybe Japan, maybe Singapore. So continuing to diversify, especially as many businesses are doing right now, and I bet will continue to do. With this rising geopolitical risk, there's also in the US, in Europe, in China, and Japan, and fill in the blank, all of them, there's growing efforts by the government to subsidize key industries, to say, like, we need to, at home, we in our country need to be better at fill in the blank industry. We can't rely on fill in the blank country, usually China, to supply us with another fill in the blank, what have you. And so they're trying to domesticate and indigenize all of these technologies. And in so doing, there are opportunities for companies to take advantage of subsidies and to make investments that aren't otherwise profitable, such as the chip companies putting locations in the United States that they wouldn't otherwise do because it's not as profitable as putting them in other locations. So there's not a whole lot of great options for mitigating against this. This is kind of the danger of geopolitical competition, is that there aren't a whole lot of winners here. There's just people who lose less than others in the ways they diversify operations, the ways they diversify investments in business. And so for right now, it's satisficing. It's trying to minimize risk. It's trying to do the best due diligence you can in China, knowing that due diligence is increasingly not a fool's errand, but increasingly less productive, less fruitful in China. So mitigating against these risks is tough, but diversifying is probably the best option here, making sure your supply chains, your markets, your consumers, your investors, no one is too reliant on any one market because things are turbulent, slowly turbulent, but they are turbulent in the Western Pacific and in Asia at large.
Well, thanks so much, Chase. Always appreciate your insights.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Emma.
We will continue to follow up with you on this as it develops, of course, and you can read more of Chase's analyses from RANE by subscribing to RANE's geopolitical intelligence products. Our suite of products and solutions allow clients to access the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions. You can sign up or learn more at our website, ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.